Here's a story for your title. HFY Reddit Tales, The Human in the Dungeon. The dungeon had stood for centuries, a sprawling labyrinth of traps, treasure, and monsters. Adventurers from all races, elves, dwarves, orcs, and even the occasional brave goblin, ventured into its depths, lured by whispers of unimaginable riches, yet none had ever returned. The dungeon had a reputation. It was alive, shifting its halls, spawning horrors to match the intruder's greatest fears. But even the dungeon, ancient and cunning, was unprepared for him. The human arrived without fanfare. He wasn't clad in enchanted armor or wielding a glowing sword. Instead, he wore a simple outfit of rugged cloth and carried an odd assortment of items: a pickaxe, a coil of rope, a notebook, and what looked like a metal contraption with a glass lens. The monsters watched from the shadows, puzzled. "What is he doing?" a lurking kobold whispered to a nearby goblin, both hidden behind a cracked wall. The human squatted near the dungeon's entrance. Pulling out the notebook, he began sketching, jotting notes, and muttering to himself. "Structural instability, odd humidity levels, bioluminescent moss," he murmured. Then, he snapped a picture of the moss with his strange device. The flash made the kobold yelp, revealing its hiding spot. Hello," the human greeted cheerfully, standing and waving. The kobold froze, unsure of whether to run or attack. Before it could decide, the human tossed it a piece of bread. "Here, peace offering. You must get hungry skulking around here all day." The kobold sniffed the bread cautiously, then took a tentative bite. It was delicious. More importantly, the human hadn't tried to kill it. Curious, the kobold followed him as he wandered deeper into the dungeon, still taking notes and muttering observations. It wasn't long before other creatures took notice. A pack of goblins cornered him in a narrow corridor. They bared their crude weapons and growled, expecting the usual fight or flight response. Instead, the human crouched and began explaining the concept of leverage using their spears as props. By the end of the impromptu lesson, the goblins were trying to build a rudimentary pulley system under his guidance. Word spread quickly. The human wasn't here to loot or slay. He wasn't like the others. He fixed broken traps, catalogued rare plants, and even patched up an injured mimic after it failed to bite him. The dungeon itself grew curious. It sent forth one of its more menacing creations, a towering, multi-eyed beast with tendrils that could crush steel. The human didn't flinch. Instead, he stared at the creature with a gleam of fascination. "Incredible, are those regenerative appendages?" he exclaimed, sketching furiously. "Do you mind if I take a tissue sample?" The beast hesitated. It had crushed armies, reduced champions to tears, but this human treated it like a fascinating puzzle rather than a threat. Unsure of what else to do, the creature allowed the human to pluck a tiny piece of its tendril. As weeks turned into months, the dungeon underwent an unprecedented transformation. Monsters stopped attacking one another and began working together. Inspired by the human's collaborative nature, traps were repurposed into elaborate mechanisms to help irrigate the dungeon's underground farms. The dungeon, once a place of chaos and bloodshed, became a thriving ecosystem. The human eventually reached the heart of the dungeon, a massive, pulsating crystal that housed its consciousness. He placed a hand on its surface and smiled. "You're not evil," he said softly. "You were just misunderstood, but don't worry, I'll help you." The dungeon, for the first time in centuries, felt a sense of peace. When the human finally left, the adventurers who ventured into the dungeon afterward found something astonishing. Instead of death and despair, they were greeted by a bustling community of monsters and an eccentric kobold guide who handed them a map. "Welcome to the dungeon," it said proudly. "We've got rules now: no killing, no stealing, and no littering." "Oh, and the human? He's a legend around here. What do you think?" Here's the continuation. HFY Reddit Tales, The Human in the Dungeon Part 2. Months passed since the human left the dungeon. The once feared labyrinth was no longer a death trap but a place of wonder, discovery, and unexpected camaraderie. Adventurers still came, but they were greeted with an invitation to join the dungeon's newfound society. The human, however, hadn't forgotten the dungeon. He returned one crisp autumn day, his pack heavier than before. This time, he brought tools, books, and odd devices the monsters could barely understand. "All right, everyone," he said, addressing a gathering of kobolds, goblins, and a particularly curious beholder. "We've got work to do. If this dungeon is going to survive in a world full of change, we need to innovate. He began teaching them. Kobolds learned to smith more intricate tools. Goblins mastered agriculture, transforming abandoned chambers into lush mushroom farms. Even the dungeon itself responded to the humans' presence, reshaping walls to make room for workshops, classrooms, and marketplaces. But not everyone was thrilled with the transformation. In the shadows, a group of disgruntled monsters, those who had thrived on chaos and violence, began to plot. They saw the human not as a savior, but as a threat to their way of life. The dungeon's transformation felt like a betrayal of its primal purpose. "He's softening us," snarled a hulking ogre. "We were feared. Now we're running a bloody tourist attraction." The group's leader, a cunning dark elf sorcerer who had once been trapped in the dungeon for her crimes, smirked. "The human thinks he's untouchable. But he's just flesh and blood. It's time we reminded him who truly rules here." The attack came suddenly. The human was deep in a lecture on basic engineering when the dark elf and her followers struck. They unleashed chaos, smashing workshops and burning farms. The beholder, caught off guard, fired a blast of energy to protect the human but was overwhelmed. The human barely managed to escape with the help of his kobold assistant, Kip. Together, they fled to the dungeon's core, the crystal that housed its consciousness. "You've got to fight back," the human urged, pressing his hands to the pulsating crystal. "This is your home. Don't let them tear it apart." The dungeon hesitated. Its voice echoed in the human's mind, ancient and weary. "I swore to harm no more," it rumbled. "You showed me a better way. And now they're destroying it," the human argued. "Protecting what you've built isn't the same as destroying. Let me help you." With a reluctant hum, the dungeon agreed. Its walls shifted, trapping the intruders in ever-narrowing corridors. Monsters loyal to the human rallied, led by Kip and the Beholder. The dark elf, however, was prepared. She unleashed a forbidden spell, aiming to shatter the dungeon's core. The human, seeing the danger, acted without hesitation. He threw himself between the elf and the crystal, his improvised shield barely holding back the magical onslaught. "Why do you care so much?" the dark elf spat, her magic surging. "It's just a dungeon. Just monsters. They're more than that," the human shouted, his voice filled with defiance. "They're people. And this place, it's worth saving." The dungeon, moved by his sacrifice, unleashed its full power. Tendrils of light erupted from the crystal, sealing the dark elf and her followers in a prison of stone. The battle was over, but the cost was high. The human lay unconscious, his body battered but alive. Kip and the other monsters carried him to a chamber they had prepared long ago, a place of healing, originally meant for injured adventurers. When the human awoke days later, he was greeted by dozens of worried faces. Kip clung to his side, tears in his large eyes. "You're okay," the kobold exclaimed. The human smiled weakly. "Did we win?" Kip nodded. "We did. But only because of you." The dungeon spoke again, its voice softer now. "You've done more than I ever imagined, human. You've made me alive. Thank you." The human, still weak but smiling, looked around at his friends, monsters who had once been enemies, now allies. He knew there was still much to do. The dungeon would face more challenges, both from within and without. But together, they would endure. "All right," he said, sitting up with a groan. "Let's get back to work. We're just getting started." And so, the human and his dungeon family continued to build, not just a safe haven, but a place where anyone, be they monster or man, could find a home. What do you think of this continuation? Should the story go even further? Here's the next part of the story. HFY Reddit Tales, The Human in the Dungeon Part 3. Word of the dungeon's transformation began to spread beyond its walls. Adventurers who once entered seeking gold or glory returned with tales of innovation, cooperation, and wonder. They spoke of a human who had befriended monsters, taught them to build and thrive, and turned a place of terror into a beacon of hope. But not all who heard these stories were inspired. Far to the north, in the gleaming halls of the Kingdom of Valor, the tales of the dungeon were seen as a threat. "A human?" scoffed High Chancellor Beric, slamming his fist on the council table. "Living among monsters, teaching them our ways? It's an abomination. If we let this stand, it won't be long before these creatures march on our cities." King Aldred, a weary but fair ruler, frowned. The reports say the dungeon has become peaceful. There's no evidence they pose a threat. Peaceful, for now, Beric retorted, but what happens when they outgrow their dungeon, when they start looking at our lands? A decision was made. A detachment of knights, mages, and battle-hardened adventurers was sent to the dungeon. Their orders were clear: dismantle the threat, by force if necessary. Inside the dungeon, life continued to flourish. Kip had taken on the role of head engineer, overseeing the construction of new systems. The goblins had organized themselves into a council, mediating disputes and ensuring resources were shared fairly. Even the grumpy ogres had found purpose, using their strength to build bridges and reinforce walls. The human, now regarded as a leader and friend, spent his days guiding projects and his nights teaching classes on everything from mathematics to diplomacy. But their peace was shattered when a scout rushed into the main hall, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Humans," the kobold cried, "dozens of them, heavily armed, they're coming this way." The dungeon's inhabitants gathered in the great hall, fear and uncertainty in their eyes. "What do we do?" asked a goblin elder. "We can't fight them," a young kobold wailed. The human stood, his expression grim but determined. "We won't fight them," he said, "not unless we have to. I'll speak to them first, maybe I can make them understand." Kip grabbed his hand, his small claws trembling. "What if they don't listen?" "Then we'll defend our home," the human replied, "but only as a last resort." When the knights arrived at the dungeon's entrance, they found the human waiting for them, unarmed and flanked by Kip and the beholder. "I'm unarmed," the human said, raising his hands. "I just want to talk." The leader of the knights, a towering man in gleaming armor, sneered. "Talk? Monsters don't negotiate, and neither do traitors." "They're not monsters," the human countered, his voice calm but firm. "They're people. They've built a community here, one that harms no one. Why can't you leave us in peace?" The knight gestured to the beholder. "That thing is a weapon of war. The creatures you defend have slaughtered countless innocents. You expect us to believe they've changed?" "They have changed," the human insisted. "I've seen it. They've learned to work together, to grow food, to build. They don't want to fight anymore." But the knights had not come to debate. At the captain's signal, they advanced, their weapons gleaming. The dungeon's defenses sprang to life, walls shifted, creating mazes to slow the intruders, non-lethal traps activated, dumping knights into pits filled with harmless but sticky slime. Kip and the goblins guided defenders to strategic positions, using smoke bombs and nets to disable the attackers without killing them. The human, in the midst of the chaos, worked tirelessly to mediate. "Stop this madness," he shouted, standing between a knight and a goblin. "We don't have to do this." But the knights were relentless. As the battle raged, the dungeon's core began to pulse with anger. The ancient entity had sworn to protect its inhabitants, and it could feel their fear and desperation. "Enough!" the dungeon's voice echoed through the halls, shaking the very ground. The knights froze as the walls parted, revealing the core, a massive, glowing crystal surrounded by swirling energy. The human stood before it, his arms outstretched. "This place isn't what you think," he said, his voice carrying an almost divine conviction. "You fear what you don't understand, but if you destroy this dungeon, you'll destroy something beautiful, something worth protecting." The energy from the core surged, creating an image in the air, scenes of monsters and humans working together, building, learning, and growing. The vision was so powerful that even the most battle-hardened knights hesitated. But the captain remained unmoved. "Enough tricks," he roared, raising his blade to strike the human. Before he could land the blow, a roar echoed through the chamber. Kip, small but brave, leapt between the human and the knight, holding a makeshift shield. "You'll have to go through me first," the kobold squeaked. One by one, the monsters stepped forward, forming a protective circle around the human. Goblins, ogres, and even the beholder stood together, their eyes burning with determination. The captain faltered, his blade lowering. "What is this?" "It's hope," the human said quietly, "a chance for something better. Please, don't take it away." The knights left that day, carrying reports of what they had seen back to the kingdom. Some called it sorcery, others a miracle, but one thing was clear: the dungeon was no ordinary place, and the human within it was no ordinary man. For now, the dungeon was safe, but the human knew this was only the beginning. The world wasn't ready to accept monsters as equals, but one day, it would be. And when that day came, the dungeon would be ready. Should we keep going?